How's it going, everyone? In today's video we're diving into one of the most iconic sounds in electronic music, 303 acid bassline. Instead of focusing on specific hardware or the acid house drummer as a whole, I thought I'd provide this tutorial basically to be a complete guide on how to achieve the acid sound using any setup. In this one we'll be covering my go-to acid plugins and stock device alternatives, how to write acid bass patterns from scratch, the best ways to process these sounds, plus for those who stick around I'll be giving away a free acid bass rack to help you get started. Let's dive in. Before we jump into some sound design, let's begin with a quick history lesson on this iconic sound. For anyone that's not familiar, the acid bassline first emerged in the mid-80s, pioneered by producers experimenting with the Roland TB-303, a synth that was originally designed to emulate a bass guitar, but quickly repurposed for its squelchy, resonant character. Early acid house records from Future, DJ Peer, and 808 State showcased this hypnotic, evolving bassline, and from there it spread into genres like techno, house, and trance. Fast forward to today, and that unmistakable acid sound is still as relevant as ever. Now that we've learned about the origins of this sound, let's dive into how you can recreate it in your own tracks. So the very first place I'd begin my search is with dedicated external acid plugins. I have two favorites when it comes to acid. One of them is the ABL, and the second one is more of a recent find, which is the Acid V. I could probably do two separate tutorials on these plugins alone, but for now I'll give you a quick overview of how they work and how I typically use them. The first one is the ABL. It's by a company called Audio Realism, and I find it's a pretty solid plugin, both in terms of the sound potential and how easy it is to use. You've essentially got this pattern section down here where you can start to generate sequences, but you also have the option of doing this and hitting note mode if you want to generate your own patterns. You also have this sound design section. You've essentially got the main parameters that allow you to really shape the control and tone of the sound. The second plugin I really like is this one called the Acid V. It works in a very similar way to the ABL. Like you'll see there's the sequencer down here. We've got a variety of controls, but what I particularly like about this plugin is it comes with a lot of different sequences. I'll just quickly run through a few. So I think if I'm doing stuff more from scratch and I had to pick one, it would probably be the ABL. But if I want some interesting sounds and just some inspiration, it's normally these sequences that I go towards. So that is essentially both plugins in a nutshell. Another thing that I've sort of touched on but we'll cover in a bit more detail is the core parameters of the acid sound. So we've got the cutoff, which is pretty self-explanatory. The cutoff also pairs really nicely with the resonance, which for visual display is essentially giving it a bit of a boost at some of the peaks as it's sweeping through, and I usually like to crank that right up. Got this envelope mod, which is once again shaping the tone of the sound with the decay. And then you've got the accent, which is basically accenting certain notes in that sequence. So those are essentially going to be my two recommendations when it comes to plugins that are dedicated to that acid sound, but there's no reason why you can't use other plugins or stock presets or samples to create similar sounds. So Ableton has a few stock options you could try. I found this 303. I've also got an acid rack here, and I'll be leaving this down in the description, or a variation of it at least. Something else I'd urge you to try is experimenting with samples. What I'll do is just a quick example, and I'll try and find something that isn't specifically acid. So I'll take this example of a sample I've used before. Could maybe go up an octave. Then what I could do is I could shape it using a filter, what I could essentially do is crank the resonance and sweep through to hear that acidy type of texture. It's not exactly the same as your 303, but you don't necessarily need to emulate that machine exactly. What you can almost aim for is a similar character of sound, and the main way to achieve that is basically by bumping the resonance up and sweeping through. So hopefully that's just given you a bit of insight into the possibilities when it comes to sound design and the fact that you don't necessarily need those amazing plugins. The next recommendation I would have is quite simply just acid loops and sequences. Basically, I'd urge you to look for loops and just listen out for inspiration. I think I found this one, which was quite nice. It wasn't anything fancy in terms of a pattern, but it just added this nice acid layer. So that is basically going to conclude this section covering the acid sound. Up next, we'll move on to pattern creation and how you can write these sequences for yourself. One of the best things I find about acid patterns is there's no rules. They can be anything from extremely basic to extremely complicated, and in this section we'll essentially be running through a few different approaches on how to write them. The very first way to write these patterns is using an inbuilt sequencer. If we return to the ABL, what I'll do is I'll show an example of how I'd use that sequencer. To recap, the ABL has a few different modes. The one that I tend to use is pattern. Basically, the way this sequencer works is you've got 16 steps. The first control is going to be the notes. As you'll see, the majority of them are playing the D, goes up an octave a few times, and then goes to the D sharp. The gate basically controls which notes play, so I could unselect a few of them, and there'll be more gaps between the notes. Basically, the more of these you have toggled on, the busier the pattern. Accent is going to accent the notes. And then slide is going to create this slide from one note to the other. If I turn it on, if I turn it off, one of the reasons I like using the built-in sequencer is because you get all these controls, especially the accent and slide, which I think is possible using Ableton's MIDI, but I think it's a bit more awkward to do. So that's basically how I'd start writing the pattern, basically starting by adjusting the notes, choosing the gate settings, and then playing around with the slide. But it's a bit of a tedious process, so what I often start with is one of the inbuilt patterns. We'll go to something like funky, we'll do this, and you've got a bunch of really nice patterns. I'll essentially load these as a starting point of inspiration and make tweaks. The other thing I like about loading these particular patterns is they already have the automations of parameters done for you, which really helps to give you a better idea of how that sound is going to sound in the context of your mix. Once you've found a pattern you like, you can either leave the plugin as it is, and what it will essentially do is, if the channel's enabled, it will play throughout the mix, but I don't really like doing it that way. What I would do instead is I would export the pattern. You do that by clicking up here and you basically go export pattern as MIDI, you save it somewhere convenient, and then you would drop the MIDI into that channel. I would then go back into the plugin and I would hit note mode so that we're no longer using the inbuilt pattern sequencer and we have control over the MIDI instead. If I quickly hop to the other plugin, it very much works in a similar way, but I don't think I've ever actually used the inbuilt sequencer. What I tend to do with this particular plugin is one of two things. I'll either audition for a particular sequence and record the single note, or I'll flick through the sequence, find something I vaguely like in terms of sound, flick it to external, and basically use the sound associated with that particular preset. The other suggestion I'll have is external sequencers. I've covered loads of these sequencers before on this channel, including an older version of this one, which is called Sting. It's essentially been designed to generate acid patterns. So what I'd basically do is I'd find a nice acid sound, I'd load this time sting, but you could also use the free version sting, and I'd basically play around with the density, which is how busy the pattern is, and I'd basically hit this to generate a pattern. Something else I will say is to put some kind of scale. You can use our free staying key tool and basically choose the key of your track. And I'd basically just keep hitting generate until I found something of interest. With the time sting, you can just hit convert and it will give you the MIDI clip, but for anyone that uses sting, you can record the MIDI out. The next thing you could do is, of course, your own patterns. While you typically have a bit of freedom in terms of how you write them, I find the following to be pretty common. So we'll take a look at this example. What you've basically got is a combination of repeated notes. Octave jumps is another one, basically adding variety to that root note by pitching it up and down an octave. You've also got these little filler notes that are applying to add variety. With regards to the MIDI, I feel like I've pretty much covered everything, but the only other thing I'll cover is different ways to use these patterns. So I think a lot of people will obviously be wanting the longer sequences if they're using this sound, but here there's a few examples where we're using very short snippets of them. This one's literally one note. I did have these other ones, but they didn't quite work. So I think the intention that I was going for here was this call and response style. There's multiple ways you can use this sound, and I'd basically encourage you to get creative. The very last place we're going to look is, of course, going to be at audio effects. As usual, I'll cover a few basic effects and then we'll maybe go into some creative options. If I'm using the acid sound, there's normally a few basic effects I like to include. So the first one is just going to be a very basic chain consisting of effects like EQs, mainly cleaning up some of the lows or the highs. Got reverbs, got delays. We'll always have a filter of some kind so that you can basically make some final tweaks after you've affected it in the instrument. We'll often have a sidechain depending on how busy the pattern is, and sometimes some compression as well. The beauty of the acid sound, I feel, is it's already a great starting point in terms of the character of it. I think I've said this before with reference to the lately bass. There's certain sounds which are already really nice right from the start, so it kind of affords you a bit more creative potential when it comes to effects. So we'll just run through a few options that you'd maybe have with regards to that. If I wanted to add a bit of crunch to this sound, I could add a lot of distortion and those similar effects. For the kind of music I normally make, I would keep it quite subtle, but you have various options if you really want to add grit to the sound there. The next one I'd maybe say is modulation. So I could try laser, a flanger, or a chorus. In this case, we'll use laser. And you could basically get creative there if you wanted to create this spacey feel to your acid sounds. We could add chorus to make the sound a bit wider. The other plugin I like to add character to these types of sounds is erosion. I've shown this trick before where you can use the Ableton stock erosion and you can basically add these artificial textures to sounds. So that is basically a rough overview of how I would process these sounds. The very last thing I'm going to talk about with regards to effects is how important automation is. I know there's a lot of people out there that find it quite tedious, but I think for this particular sound, I'd say it's pretty necessary. Where I typically start is actually with the core parameters of the synth. So I could either draw it in by hand, or I could record it in live. If you have any hardware that has a MIDI knob, I find that that's a very convenient way to map these things. But if you don't, you can automate using just the mouse. What you do if you want to record it in live using the mouse is you arm the channel, you hit this up here, you would hit record. And then what you could do is you could move the channel. And you could basically record this fairly wacky automation. You'll see there's not really been much process other than going up and down and then slowly trying to build towards the end of every 8 bars. So So that's pretty much in a nutshell how I'd approach automation. I wouldn't be overthinking it, and I wouldn't be spending ages fine-tuning these things, but I think simply by just using it, you can take your acid sounds up a level massively. You'll see here, we've then automated the delay, but you can start getting creative with automating your effects. Alright people, that is going to wrap up this one. I hope this guide has given you all the information and techniques that you need to start experimenting with that acid sound in your tracks. If you found this video helpful, then be sure to like, subscribe, and let us know in the comments if you have any questions or if you have any video requests. As always, I'll be leaving a couple of videos that I think you might enjoy next. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next one.